So today, what I'll be doing is talking about the Japanese giant salamanders. And so I'll give you guys a brief history because when people know that, hey, you work at the Calvert Marine Museum, why are you talking about fieldwork with animals that live on the other side of the world? But this is from a former job that I had, but still pretty cool. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and Rebecca will go through and see what's out there. Feel free to interrupt too. I don't mind to talk in the middle of the presentation, but we'd also just save for questions at the end too, whichever one works for all of you guys. So kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And I do repeat some of this stuff from presentation to presentation just because I don't know who is new and who is not. But just a brief overview of salamanders and the Japanese giant salamander. If you guys are interested in herps, there's a big chance you already know all about salamanders, but for those that might just be interested to see what the program's all about, you will get a little biology lesson. I'll also be talking about the captive breeding program at the National Zoological Park where I used to work, at least kind of what it was like before I moved to the Calvert Marine Museum. And I will talk about, because there was two trips. I did a trip to the Honolulu Zoo, and I'll talk about that, as well as a few locations in Japan to do some education outreach, field work, but also seeing how Japanese giant salamanders are exhibited. So where it all started, I try and nip this in the bud just because usually a lot of folks ask how I got to where I am now. So it all started, it's the picture of me and my brother, obviously many years ago. So this is probably sometime in the 90s. But ever since I could remember, I always wanted to be outdoors. And so my dad, who is right here, I mean, obviously we were both a lot older than we used to be about 30 years ago. Um, he took me out behind his work where he heard frogs calling and something clicked. I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and I was always begging to try and go out and find herps. So I didn't realize it was called herping back in the day. But I knew I always wanted a chance to be outside. So it was pretty cool because we would go on all these trips. I would always ask him what stuff was, and now I'm telling him what stuff is. So it is kind of neat, just to kind of, be on the other side of that now. So most recently, during the eclipse, so I guess it was like 2 years ago now, or a year or so ago, we went out to Oklahoma and Arkansas, one of my favorite places, but I say that about everywhere, where they have some pretty cool endemic salamanders out there, but also just some other neat species. And he had never been to either of those states before, so it was nice to kind of show him around a few of the places I had been. But these are also some other pictures of other trips that we have taken out to either Southern Appalachia, West Virginia, or kind of the Pacific coast. But if it wasn't for my dad, I probably wouldn't be doing this talk tonight. So, how it started and how it's going. So, pretty soon, I guess, after doing all that herping throughout childhood, I realized this might be something I want to do for a living. So, in between, I think it was actually high school when I started interning and then ended up being a part-time staff member at the Long Branch Nature Center in Arlington, Virginia. So, this is me with a spotted salamander, yellow spotted salamander. And then pretty soon after that, I got a job at Smithsonian National Zoo where I was for almost 12 years. And although got my love for native species at Long Branch Nature Center, I got to work with a lot of really awesome animals that I, had only dreamed about working with since I was a kid. So like Komodo dragons, Aldabra tortoises, indigo snakes, Chinese alligators. A dream come true. But one thing I always noticed, I was always trying to tie it back to native species, just so folks kind of had, a connection with what animals are in their backyards and how they can kind of conserve and protect those animals. While I was at the National Zoo, I was also working with the Virginia Herpetological Society, where I was a member, I think, since 2012, 2013. I became vice president from 2015 to 2017, and then president from 2017 to 2019. I'm president again too. So I love it. This is kind of where I wanted to sort of kind of go back to where it all started. So it was awesome. I love captive animals. I love working with them. But I also love going out and doing field work too. And so since being with them, I think I've been leading surveys with them since 2015. Um, about to lead another survey this weekend, our annual survey. It's going to be down in the northern neck of Virginia. So now that I live in Southern Maryland, I try and choose locations that are a little bit easier for me to get to. But we did do some really cool ones that go into Dixie Caverns to find a rare salamander. Back then was the Whirly salamander. Now it's its own species. But it is pretty cool to kind of go out and kind of see what species you could target. Like got my first cottonmouth on these surveys. Same with king snakes and um, eastern milk snakes and Jefferson salamanders. So a lot of cool opportunities to kind of go out in the field. And since 2022, I've been curator of Estuarine Biology at the Calvert Marine Museum. So we are dedicated to three pillars, maritime history, paleontology, and estuarine biology. So estuarine biology is kind of just a fancy way to say the Department of the Living Collection. So we have roughly 600 individual animals of around 70 species. So majority of them are going to be fish, fresh and saltwater. So it's going to be animals that are found all around Southern Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay. But I would say our pandas of the Calvert Marine Museum would be our North American river otters that you can see Calvert right up here with one of the paintings that he did. But we also have Eastern Hellbenders, which I gave a talk a little while ago, as well as some herp species and pretty much everything in between. But one thing I really like to do is try and do a lot of field work as well. And if you get to know me more, you'll see all the cool stuff that I've been doing. But now, as we segue into salamanders and the Japanese giant salamander, I'm just going to do a little bit of amphibian and salamander 101, just in case there's anyone that doesn't know too much about amphibians. So with amphibians, there are usually around, I'd say, three or four things that kind of justify what makes an amphibian an amphibian. So they're ectothermic, or as some people like to say, cold-blooded. But all that really means is they don't really generate their own body heat. They just retain it from the environment around them. They have slimy skin, unlike reptiles that have scaly, dry skin. These guys also have gelatinous eggs, kind of like fish eggs. Um, and when you compare them to reptiles, which have leathery, kind of harder shelled eggs, that's a key difference. And then for these guys too, most of the time they lack claws, but we'll see an animal towards the end of the presentation that has almost claws. That's a type of salamander. And amphibian means two lives, so they live part of their lives in the water and part on land. And as you see, there's usually a lot of asterisks. So with science, the one thing that even though I love science, growing up, it was like, hey, whatever you learned last year, this is actually the full truth. Um, so that's just hard because as humans, right, we want to define everything, but science and nature, they don't care. Nature just wants to exist. And so we try and write the rules to kind of explain what's happening, but really animals are just trying to survive. So there's always exceptions to the rules. But amphibians are one of the oldest vertebrate classes alive, and they appeared around 350 million years ago. So if you guys know a little bit about amphibians, you'll know that there are three orders. So you have Anura, which are the frogs and toads, and there is roughly, I think the most updated numbers I have seen, and again, it changes daily, is around 8,000 individuals. Salamanders and newts, now it's around, I believe, 830. There's about to be a few new species, I think, described. And again, a lot of it is genetic work that kind of describes new species. And then you have Sicilians, and so a lot of folks have not heard of these guys before just because we don't have them locally. These are found in more equatorial regions of the world. So if you just follow the equator around a lot of the tropical areas in South America, in Africa and Southeast Asia is where you'll find a lot of these guys. But specifically salamanders, a little bit of biology and physiology of these guys. Salamanders have a long body, most of the time four limbs and clawless toes. They are really variable in size, the most of any amphibian. So they can be as small as 1 inch, like the pygmy salamander that lives in southwestern Virginia, or they can be over 5 feet, like some of the animals we're about to learn about today, and I think the next two slides. But a majority of them are going to be around 4 to 7 inches. And they can have lungs, they can have gills, or they can have neither. And some of them, like the ones on the next slide, are actually a lungless species. So salamanders cannot hear, and they're fairly quiet, even though sometimes they can kind of emit a squeak or a squawk or a grunt or growl if they're larger. But they do have a vestigial middle ear bone, so they can detect vibrations and things like that as well. And costal grooves are super important, especially for local species, because a lot of them do look very similar. And again, if you're just a 4 to 7 inch salamander, that's not huge. So good luck actually counting the costal grooves with your naked eye. But usually, what I will do is if I think I'm in the range of a certain species, take a picture, and then you can kind of blow it up on your computer or phone later and try and count those grooves. So the costal grooves will correspond with these trunk vertebrae. So it's essentially vertebrae that are in between their limbs. And so you could see all these little grooves or ridges right here would be a costal groove. And that's super important for some of the salamanders on this page right here. So especially in the genus Plethodon, it is a very expansive genus or genera of salamander. And this is the Cinereus clade, so the kind of the smallest of all of them. There's a few clades. I think you have Whirlii, you have Glutinosis, which are the spotted sal or the slimy salamanders down here. You have Wellerii, which are some of the smaller southwestern Appalachian species. And then you have the Cinereus, which is essentially central Appalachian and north. And so all of these guys are different species. And I know they look very, very similar. So again, the costal groove count is the and geographic location are what will really tell all these folks apart. So here you can see this is a lot of costal grooves. So I'm trying to just do it from memory from which pictures I took. But this one is Plethodon hoffmanni, and I believe there's 21 costal grooves on this one. So this was on a friend's property in West Virginia, and I was in range, but then again, that picture is worth 1,000 words. This one right here is Plethodon whirlii. They have 16 costal grooves, and again, you can see they kind of have that similar kind of purpley gray color with, some iridescent flecks. But for these guys, especially this juvenile right here, this little red spot is indicative of that species when they're young, at least in the northern parts of their range. Up here we have I believe this one was the Southern Ravine Salamander, and these guys have around, I believe it's 17 costal grooves. So a lot of these guys look very similar to the leadback form of the redback salamander, and those guys have around 18 to 19 costal grooves. So if it's any more or less, it's usually a different species. This one down here is the slimy salamander, I believe specifically the white spotted slimy, at least in the location that I found it in. And those guys, I believe, have around 16 to 17 costal grooves. And then these two are very closely related. They have the same count of costal grooves. Both of these have 16 to 17. And these are kind of the Shenandoah specific clade of the Cinereus clade. So you have the Shenandoah salamander here, which are only found on 3 mountain peaks in the Shenandoah National Park and nowhere else on Earth. They also have a redback and leadback form. This one right here is Peaks of Otter Salamander around, I believe it's along the Blue Ridge Parkway. I think it might be National Forest. I'm not 100% sure. But with these guys, kind of more gold iridescent flecks, but again, jet black bellies and the same costal groove count, but they're going to be in different locations. So again, costal grooves, costal grooves, costal grooves, if you're really going to try and delve into salamander biology. So there's around 800 plus species, probably closer to 850 right now, and they're divided into 10 families. So this is just a smattering of some of the ones that we have in Appalachia, in Maryland. These two guys are in California right here. Same with the Ensatina up here. So there's a lot of neat species. So this is where salamanders live throughout the globe. So all the 800 plus species are found right in front of you. And you'll notice most of it's blue or kind of maybe a little greenish, but you can see salamander biodiversity right here in the United States, in the eastern half of the US, is like nowhere else on Earth, specifically Appalachia right here. And so when people go, what's the big deal about salmon? Kind of nondescript, I'm like, and the numbers that we see them. So the second hotspot would be right here, kind of the coast over here. So salamanders are a big deal. Over a third of all species are found in the U.S. alone. Another third is going to be kind of in Central and South America, and then the rest of the globe over here will be the last third of them. But you can see that they are absent in Australia, in most of Southeast Asia, most of Africa. A few, I like to kind of think of them as European species that just happen to be in the really northern part of Africa where it's dry, but they still have some more wet seasons. So here are those families. If you want to see at least a few, I'd probably say that not the most updated species counts, but for most of them, yes. So today we're going to be talking about the cryptobranchid salamanders. So that's the giant salamanders. But I would say the largest family right here is Plethodonidae. That's the lungless species and a majority of what a lot of the salamanders are in our area. Another big chunk of salamanders will be Salamandridae. So that's going to be the newts and a lot of the old world species of salamanders. They have a lot more newts than we do in the US, as well as like fire salamanders and things like that. And then the high-nobid salamanders is another big group, and that's pretty much an Asian group of salamanders. And I do have some examples of the high-nobid salamanders that I was able to see at one of the zoos in Japan. What you guys all came for is the cryptobranchid salamanders. Those are the giant salamanders. So there's three species worldwide, but now I believe the Chinese giant salamander has been split into three species. So with that, that means that there's five species worldwide. So three of them will be in China, one will be in Japan, and one will be in the United States, and that would be the Hellbender. So these guys are the largest salamanders on Earth. The next slide kind of goes through all the sizes of all of them. All of them are aquatic, but they do have lungs to breathe, or they have lungs rather that they gulp for air, but they breathe through their skin. So their life cycle I'll talk about in a little bit when we talk about the Japanese giant salamander, but their life cycle is fairly interesting. Also, the males will rear their young in dens from several females, which is interesting, right? Because most male animals don't take care of their young, but also most animals that are not a mammal or bird rarely take care of their young. So the males will guard these babies until they are big enough to leave the den. So most all these guys are going to be at high elevation, cool streams. So no matter how warm it is on the outside, these streams are coming from the mountains, and so they are just always fairly cool. And that's what these salamanders need, especially if they're breathing through their skin. The faster moving water is just going to replenish oxygen over their skin, as well as the cooler temperatures will have a higher oxygen content. So this is a cute graphic from Peppermint Narwhal, but it makes these ugly salamanders look cute. But we have the Hellbender salamander here, and a little disjunct population. They're not quite their own species yet, but it's the Ozark Hellbender that's over in Missouri and Arkansas. You have the Japanese giant salamander that we're learning about today that's found in this area. I'll expand their range in the next few slides. And you have the Chinese giant salamander here, which is the largest of all of them. So the Chinese giant can actually, I think the largest one ever was 5 foot 10 inches. So that's incredible, over 100 pounds. But I think a majority of them are going to be like 4 to 5 feet, would be a very large one. The Japanese giant salamanders can get upwards of like 3.5 feet, maybe 4 feet if you're super, super large Japanese giant salamander, but 3 to 3.5 feet usually for these guys. And then the Hellbender, I think the maximum size is around 2.5 feet, but for the most part, they're going to be under 2 feet. And that's our giant salamander right there. So again, when you look to see where else they live on Earth, and they're all the way over on the other side of the globe, I think it's pretty cool that we have them in the United States. So the Japanese giant salamander. So again, they pretty much follow the same rules for all the other giant salamanders. So these guys can be upwards of 5 feet. Again, I think a majority of them are going to be around 4. And they can live over 70 years old. So pretty long-lived salamander. But it also takes them a long time to actually get to breeding age. So that does hurt them in that instance if there's a lot of habitat destruction and things like that. So kind of like I mentioned earlier, they're going to live in clean, fast-flowing streams. So their life cycle, again, the male is going to be looking after the eggs and even the larvae until after they hatch a little bit, protecting it from all those little babies from predators or even other giant salamanders that want a free snack. And that's just pretty neat. So these little larvae will look just like any other salamander larvae with little gills. And then by the time they get to adult, they will lose those gills and develop lungs, but they don't actually breathe with those lungs. So they'll use them like a swim bladder, like fish use, to help them float or sink. So they'll gulp air and they can kind of regulate whether they want to float or sink, either by expelling it. But that's why a lot of these salamanders are going to be really wrinkly. You can see they have extra surface area of their skin. I'm going to go back to the Hellbender I have, and you can see a lot of that extra folds coming over my hand right there. Um, yeah, so they need a lot of that extra skin to help breathe. With these guys, again, they look all very similar, but the Japanese giant salamanders have these big tubercles on them, and that's kind of what these little bumps all over their face, and that is what kind of differentiates them from the Chinese giants that don't really have those bumps at all, and then the hellbenders that have some bumps, but just not as prominent. And their name, Hanzaki, um, in Japan kind of means giant pepperfish, and that's just a smell that they emit when they're stressed out or taken out of water. So the hellbenders and the Japanese giant salamanders can make kind of this exudate, is like this white, slimy mucus type of secretion. Specifically with the Japanese giant salamanders, though, it smells very peppery. And I'll get into folklore as I'm going into kind of the education component of my trip to Japan. So this is the range. So this is Japan right here, if you guys are not familiar. And this is the range of the Japanese giant salamanders. And I kind of marked some cities on here where either I went or just that you might be familiar with. So Tokyo's up here. Everyone knows about Tokyo. And so there's one little population here, but that might have actually been an introduced population. So they're going to be kind of in the more the southern part of this kind of main island. So Hiroshima right here, Yubara Springs, and these are two areas that I went to, as well as Kyoto over here. I didn't go there, but that's another part of the kind of the northern part of their range. So the National Zoo. So when I worked at the National Zoo, we received six individuals from the Asa Zoo, which is the zoo that I ended up visiting in 2009. Um, when I started there, we only had, I believe, four. So I don't know if some just didn't pass quarantine or they ended up getting a disease or something like that. So we had four that were behind the scenes at RDC, which is the Reptile Discovery Center. But we also had an additional one that lived on Asia Trail, but I believe she is now down at the reptile house currently. But no one has successfully bred Japanese giant salamanders in the United States and potentially even in the world, even though Germany seems to be doing a lot of cutting edge things in a closed system. So the Asa Zoo regularly breeds them, but they have an open system. So they are bringing water from outside, which is their habitat. Um, and I think that's kind of a big component on how they're so successful with breeding them. So in 2019, when I first did this trip, we were going to be opening up an exhibit at the Reptile Discovery Center on the Japanese giant salamanders, in addition to the one that we had up at the Asia Trail exhibit. And I believe it did open in 2021 before I left. But another big thing too, I wanted to try and draw focus on our local salamanders. So in Japan, they don't really have a fish and wildlife protection service for a lot of their wildlife. And so, kind of head starting and other conservation programs are a little tricky and a little difficult to do. Um, but they did, I guess, kind of lobby and got the Japanese giant salamander named as a national treasure. And so these guys are protected in that regard. So here's an example of the exhibit up at Asia Trail. So we have a model here. This one I think is actually the size of a Chinese giant salamander, but just to kind of show you how big some of them can get. And so this is in the same section where like the red pandas are, the pandas, the fishing cats, the clouded leopards. So it was nice to have a herp species that they were focusing on. So they were just kind of talking about the Japanese giant salamanders and then kind of built into the rock so you kind of feel like you're in their environment as well. And so this is kind of the behind the scenes that we have for the Japanese giant salamanders at the zoo, or at least back then. I don't think they've changed anything since I've left. But they had these little dens over here, so they can kind of have their own little ranges and things like that. So this tank right here is probably about 8 feet wide by about 4 feet deep. And so they had three of these tanks kind of in the middle of the amphibian section. Um, at the zoo, and they were all connected. So the salamanders can kind of go and get away from each other if they wanted to. I think when I first started, we all had them separated. But then if you want to get them to breed, you do need to have kind of a little hierarchy going on. So you will have one big, massive male, which ours was named Hero, like Hiroshima. Um, Hiro, and he was kind of like the big den master. And then we had two females and a smaller male. So I believe the Asia Trail exhibit does not exist anymore, and that female came down where there's four total now at the Reptile Discovery Center. So, I really wanted to go and kind of explore the wild in Japan and try and see how to better our exhibit and breeding program at the National Zoo. So I was able to get two grants. The first one funded the trip to Japan, and then and so that was in 2019, I believe, the summer of 2019. In the winter of 2018, the Honolulu Zoo became the first zoo to breed and get eggs from a Japanese giant salamander. So they didn't actually rear them up. The eggs didn't survive to hatching, but they got pretty far. So I was able to say, hey, I would like to try and see what their program is like over there as well. So there were three goals. It was kind of ex situ, which would means like not in the field, but in captivity, and just try and see what other zoos are doing. So the Asa Zoo is where we got the Japanese giant salamanders, the Honolulu Zoo that did breed them, the only zoo in the U.S. to do it so far. Then the Ueno Zoo as well. I met a woman who was the registrar at the Ueno Zoo in Tokyo, and it was actually one of my volunteers at the Reptile Discovery Center was playing frog calls because he was also involved with FrogWatch. And I think I had a meeting that day, so I missed her. And so she was still in town for a few days. So I was going to meet up when she was visiting in DC, but then we had one of those famous government shutdowns. So I actually met up with her at Starbucks, and she said, "Hey, if you do get this grant, come meet me at the Ueno Zoo, and I could show you some cool stuff that we're doing." So I was able to work that into the grant. So kind of serendipitous how it happened, and then pretty cool that we got to see each other on opposite sides of the globe when I went out there to go visit. But I also wanted to see kind of in situ work in the field to try and really get an idea of like what does their habitat look like, and maybe what are some things that we're not even thinking about that we could be missing out on with breeding the Japanese giant salamander. And then also, I had heard about the Hanzaki Festival, which I'll talk about a little bit what the Hanzaki is. Um, but what I wanted to do is improve the educational programming and messaging regarding the Japanese giant salamanders, but also just our local species of salamanders, since they are so revered in Japan. I wanted to try and see what do they do, just to kind of get people excited about native species, and that was in Yubara Springs in Japan. So these are the three locations in Japan where I did go. So Hiroshima was the first place, and then flying in there late at night and then driving 3 hours and getting in Yubara Springs at 2 a.m. was not fun in a foreign country. But and on the other side of the road when you're driving, but still a very neat place to go. And then the last place was Tokyo, is where I went in Japan to the Ueno Zoo. But it
While
also
you're on location, sorry to interrupt. Someone
no,
asked
no
if you
worries.
went to Mount Dyson. One of Was that one of the locations that you went to?
It was not. Unfortunately, just because it was a work trip, I just didn't have unlimited time. So I did do some hiking around here in Yubara Springs, but I actually wasn't like diving in the water to try and find these salamanders, and it was fairly dry too. So I think I went to like a lot of temples and things like that. Hiroshima, I went with the Asa Zoo, and we actually went out. It was kind of in a rice paddy area, about 45 minutes to an hour and a half north of Hiroshima, where we did some of the field work there. So I wish I had more time to actually explore Japan. I mean, it's on my list to kind of go back and see some of the things I missed. I would love, love, love to go to one of the southern islands. I've worked with some newts in the past that are from Okinawa, so I would love to kind of see some of those areas. But it started at the Honolulu Zoo in Oahu, which is, I guess, the most populated island in Hawaii. So I got to meet up with Rebecca right here, who I still keep in touch with. I forget this gentleman's name because I've only met him one time. But really, what I wanted to do is kind of see what it was like keeping animals in Hawaii, just because they have a lot more regulations there on a small unique island than we do here, say, in Maryland. But they do, I think they have two different breeding groups of Japanese giant salamanders. And so this is just kind of an example. It's very bright and sunny, shocker, in Hawaii. And so you had to, I don't think I took a picture of it, but you had to kind of go through this kind of curtain area to then see the exhibits. And a big reason for that is just the glare in the sun. But then a second one is just to try and really maintain the temperature. Even though it's hot, you do have a really good breeze going, but that sun is brutal in Hawaii. So it was pretty neat because right here they're just talking about the island ecosystems, and kind of how Hawaii and Japan are both sister zoos. But it is also interesting, just talking about how to mitigate, introduce species and things like that when you're on a very sensitive island. And then over here, this is an example of their big chiller system, which was all outside. So it is covered so it doesn't get rained on. And again, it's needs to be outside so you're not creating too much heat inside, and then you're kind of combating, the heat from the system versus trying to also cool down the system. But it is shaded because you don't want the system overheating if it's sitting in direct sun in Hawaii. But you can see a lot of these cold water loops. We actually have the same ones at the Calvert Marine Museum as well. So a pretty expensive system, but well worth it when you have pretty sensitive animals. At the National Zoo, we didn't have a system this crazy, just because our Japanese giant salamanders were kept in an amphibian section, so the room was already cooled down pretty cool. So we didn't really need a big state-of-the-art closed cold loop system. But also, I got to see some other cool animals that they had there. So they had gharial, they had Galapagos tortoises, a pretty rare golden conure. At the time, I swore they were close to being extinct in the wild, but I just looked them up and they're vulnerable. So I think they're a pretty rare conure, but not as rare as they used to be. And then I got to see some Komodo dragons, which was really neat for me, just because I did work with Murphy, the very large Komodo dragon, at the National Zoo. But the National Zoo is also the first zoo to breed Komodo dragons outside of their native Komodo island chain. And this is actually one of the babies from that original birth. I believe it was in 19, or excuse me, hatching in 1992. Just because there might be some kids in this program. I'm not going to say the name of him, but it is an expletive. But it is cool to see that he is still alive. I don't believe he's alive anymore. I think he died, I think, a year after I visited, but it was still really cool to see one of the original Komodo dragon hatchings when I worked with, the place where it all started. And I got to do some herping on Oahu. And I don't know if you guys know, there are no native herps to Oahu or any of the Hawaiian island chains. The only native animals are going to be birds and insects, so animals that can fly. And then I believe the Hawaiian monk seal, but it's technically not a land animal, so sometimes people don't count those in the totals. Um, but that's also why they have such strict rules in what you can keep, but also what zoos can have. So these were all, I believe, at one of the botanic gardens around there. So you have the gold dust day geckos, as well as Dendrobates auratus, which I believe is like the green and black dart frog, is the common name. They are worried about introduced snake species. So at the zoo, they're only allowed to have two species of snakes, and I believe can't even remember what snakes they were, but they're not allowed to have female snakes either. They have to be only males and only a single one of each species. So they really just don't want anything getting out. But then again, I'm like, they have Komodo dragons, which could easily live in Hawaii. So who knows? But those are just their rules. And I got to meet an old colleague as well. This is Mike Henley. He works with corals, and he was in the invertebrate exhibit before it closed at the National Zoo. But he was going to get his PhD at the U University of Hawaii, so it was nice to meet up with him because I hadn't seen him in a couple of years at that time, and it was just kind of neat to see some of the coral work that he's doing, as well as seeing some of the other stuff that other PhD students were working on, like some sharks and things like that. So after Honolulu, I took a nice long flight, and if you guys think about it, Hawaii is not on the way to Japan. I thought it was. So the first flight to Honolulu was, gosh, like 9 to 10 hours direct from Dulles, and then it was like another 9 hours to get over to Japan. So this kind of just shows you, but I actually landed in Hiroshima, which is a little bit further south. So Hanzaki. So it's a mythical creature. So as the legend has it, there was a very large monster salamander that would terrorize livestock and a lot of locals up in Ubara Springs. There was a very brave um, knight over here or soldier that was able to kill the Hanzaki, but how he did it, he got engulfed by the Hanzaki and then cut his way out. And then ever since that happened, the visitor or the villagers loved this guy and he was famous, but weird things started happening in the city. And as legend goes, there'd be again livestock missing, there'd be weird crying at night, and just weird things would be happening in the city. And so they thought it was a spirit of this giant salamander that was slain, and so they now have a Hanzaki festival, which they've been having now forever. There is a shrine in Yubara Springs for to kind of pay respect to Hanzaki, and ever since they started paying respects to this spirit, the Hanzaki spirit, um, the city and town was not terrorized anymore, even from the spirit. And so they do have like the Hanzaki festival just to kind of pay homage to the spirit, but also it's a little bit of an educational and just kind of a party atmosphere. And so they have the male and the female spirit, and they pay homage to both of them. Do believe I took a picture of the shrine, but I don't think I included it with all these pictures just for sake of time. But it was pretty cool because they would parade these all around, and then it'd be like this humongous festival. I was hoping that it would be a little bit more educational. It turns out that it really wasn't. There was maybe one little booth that had I think a Japanese giant salamander on display where you can learn a little bit about it. But most of the stuff we're just buying little tchotchkes, buying kind of more like I don't know, like kind of fair or like festival garb, like a lot of kids' toys, a lot of food and street food and things like that. But it was still very neat to see just this very small town, just like quintuple in size. And where I was staying, I think this was actually right from the hotel. So the hotel was like right in the center of all of it, which is pretty awesome. And then all around Yubara Springs, they live up to their name as Hanzaki capital. So you can see all these statues and fountains and traffic cones and windsocks and just weird statues in the hotel that they had. But they definitely love their Japanese giant salamanders there. But I did happen to come across the Hanzaki Center, which is just a little bit south of the main strip in town, the next day after the festival. And that was pretty neat, just because it's a museum solely dedicated to the giant salamander. So obviously, the Japanese giant salamander, but also they talk about here the three species, at least at the time, of giant salamanders in the world. And I believe they had all three of them. Just the Hellbender was off exhibit, but they did have one there. And then they also had a fossil of one that was found, I believe, in Switzerland, which is neat because there's no giant salamanders that live there currently. Um, so if I were to actually zoom in on the picture, I could probably see when the last known specimen was found over there. But yeah, it was just pretty neat that they had babies that I believe they got from the Asa Zoo. So they had some very small hellbent, or excuse me, some very small giant salamanders there as well as this preserved specimen. So this one's very large. I would guess over 4.5 feet, close to 5 feet. This is not a true Japanese giant salamander. So one of the problems they're having in some of the northern ends of their range is hybridization with the Chinese giant salamander. So the Chinese giant salamander, even though it's critically endangered in the wild, is fairly common in captivity because it is bred for food in China. And I believe, I don't know how long ago, I think it was probably in the 70s, some had made it into Japan and were released. And the hybrids of the Japanese and Chinese giant salamander actually get bigger than the Chinese giant salamander and way more aggressive. So that is one thing that they are worried about when they're doing field work to try and see genetically which animals are which. Um, but yeah, I'll get into that in a little bit. Some of the field work I got to do. So this is where I was trekking through. So there's a lot of dams and waterfalls. It's hard to see in this picture, but here's a little ladder that they make so these animals can still go upstream where they usually want to go to breed. So in addition to Japanese giant salamanders, I got to see some other cool herps in the wild. So the black spotted frog, the Japanese wrinkled frog, and the Japanese keelback. So all of these are fairly common species. I asked 5 times before picking it up whether this was a venomous snake, just because I was not well versed. I knew about I believe it's called like the mamushi. I could be saying that totally wrong, but it's the equivalent of like a Japanese copperhead. It is fairly venomous. It looks very similar to a copperhead. It is closely related to our eastern copperheads that we have over here, or northern copperheads. Um, I was really hoping for some firebelly newts or yeah, so some of the Cynops species out there because we were in rice paddy fields, but the unfortunately, but fortunately, the giant salamanders are the only ones that I ended up seeing. So here is one of the ones. It was actually one of the smallest ones that we got, and I was beyond ecstatic. I was really excited. So one was in one of the breeding dens because I did believe it was late August when I went there, so it would be kind of the tail end of when they're really doing their breeding. So we did not disturb that male. But this is one that I got to catch in a net. Um, Yuki was the one who was taking us out, and he was saying that there's one right in front of you, and I was like, I do not see it. Because again, he has the eye for it, I don't. And I was like, oh my God, is it that thing right there? Because they blend in so well with the rocks, and the water's moving very fast. And I scooped it up, and we kind of weighed and measured it, as you can see on the next slide. So if you guys saw the Hellbender program that I did, this is almost exactly the same stuff. So taking measurements, length, taking weights, and then pit tagging. This is really important because this animal had not been pit tagged before. So even though they've been doing this field work for about 20 years, they estimate this animal was around at least 20 years old and had just gone undetected all this time. So because they had not pit tagged it yet, we inserted a pit tag, and that was its pit tag number. So pit tags are just a microchip, but just that's what you call it for reptiles and amphibians. And then one thing that we did not do with the hellbenders on the previous talk is take a genetic sample. And so a big reason for that, they want to see A, how closely related it is to the other giant salamanders that are found in the same habitat, but also they want to make sure that there are no hybrids with the Chinese giant salamander. So at the Asa Zoo, the next day, bright and early, we went to the zoo to try and see what their facilities were like. And this was their breeding facility right here. And so as you can see, it is outdoors, and I think that is a big reason for their success. So you have a very big den area here. Some of the smaller species were in here, where they can kind of travel in between all these little sections over here. But this is an open system, so this means that they're bringing the water in from the environment, which I think is really a big tip or trick for them, just because any of the dissolved solids and other kind of elements that are kind of coming in off the mountains will be going into these systems as well, which is something that's very hard to replicate in captivity. And likewise, like at the zoo, we would definitely not be bringing in water from Rock Creek Park into that tank just because it's very nasty, dirty water. So it's just kind of hard to replicate this at the National Zoo. But here's an example, and almost exactly how we had them set up at the National Zoo was kind of we had three tanks, but there are four little sections over here where each one could have their own den or hiding place. But they can also kind of go in and communicate and mess with each other if they want to. So the den master was in this den all alone. He was massive. And again, you can see how warty that head is. And then here were some smaller males and females that were in a den on the other side in a different enclosure away from that big male. Just because, again, they're really only kind of going over there during breeding. A lot of the females will kind of enter his den during the breeding season, but will try and stay away most of the time. And then here are some of the rearing tanks that they had. So I first saw those guys and they started off very small, as you can see. So I tried to have my hand in the picture just so people could get a pretty good idea of the size of these guys. So, I mean, honestly, these were probably the size of like two-line salamanders, not very big at all. Whereas these guys were probably the size of red salamanders that we have locally. Whoops. But they got bigger every enclosure we went into. These are probably the size of the Hellbenders when I first started working with them at the National Zoo. These guys are probably roughly like 6 to 8 inches. And then he was like, "Hey Matt, come over here and take a look at this one." And it was a ginormous tub. I was like, no way. And so he opened it, and it was a Chinese giant salamander. So this guy was actually confiscated, that someone was trying to bring into the country. But as you can see right here, no warts on the head, or very few, but they have these big lichen-like blotches on the sides. And again, you can see all the kind of frilly lasagna sides, if you want to call them that. To really absorb oxygen in the water. This one was over 60 pounds, which is massive for a salamander. And that's not even as big as they can get, but his head was bigger than mine. So it was just nuts to see an animal that big. And I think it's the only Chinese giant salamander I've seen. And technically it's outside, so that kind of counts as seeing it in the wild, right? And then here's just an example of the date of the last weight. Um, I don't know, I could try and do that on my phone really quick. 21,400 grams in pounds. All right, so that says just under 50 pounds. Um, but the animal is still alive today, and so I wouldn't be surprised if it's over 60 pounds now. So 47.8 pounds, I think that is. Um, Fatness scale out of 10, pretty big animal, right? And then this is one of the largest that they had here is a Japanese giant salamander. I'm just trying to see. Yeah, so you can see significantly less. It's like about 5,000 grams less. So much smaller, but still a very big animal. And so this is Yuki right here. He's world famous in terms of Japanese giant salamanders. He is your guy. Who's basically supplied almost all the zoos around the world with Japanese giant salamanders because of their breeding program. And so what was pretty neat, which I believe they took the picture. I don't have it, but I actually got to meet with their director. Again, because they don't have a Fish and Wildlife Service, so the fact that someone from the United States wanted to visit, was humongous. And so I got to meet with the director. I took photo ops and things like that, just so they could really kind of show the powers that be, um, hey, like this is a world-renowned program, and we have people from all over the world that want to kind of come visit and see what we're doing. So some big takeaways, their breeding setups were really phenomenal to see, and similar to kind of what we had at the zoo, but we did have Yuki come out and kind of show us when we first got started. But like I mentioned before, it's an open system, which is very hard to replicate. The fluctuating water levels, I think, is something really important that we started doing after this trip at the National Zoo. Also, more dramatic temperature variation. Um, you can't see it in this picture. I was sweating my butt off. It was 95 degrees here in Hiroshima at the zoo. But these high elevation streams, the water was like 55 degrees. Um, so the water was very cold, even though it was very hot outside. But there's some other environmental factors that are just hard to replicate exactly how they do at the Asa Zoo. Another neat thing too, one of the guys was like, hey, we want you to identify this snake. And I said, guys, I don't know Japanese snakes, but apparently they get their hay from the United States, like the Midwest. And I thought it looked kind of like a bull snake a little bit. So it was kind of neat how you had a stowaway in the hay, but it probably most likely got chopped up. It was definitely an old, dried out, almost mummified snake. But probably when they were processing all the hay and the grass and stuff like that. So just kind of neat American snake ID in Japan. And then the Ueno Zoo. And so I was like, oh yeah, that's super close. It was like a 9 hour drive. So I ended up getting a flight instead. But this is right outside of Tokyo. So again, that woman that I had met at Starbucks, that one of my volunteers was chatting with, she's the registrar. So she got to take me around to a bunch of the different locations. But I'm solely just going to focus on the herp section that they had there at the Ueno Zoo. And they had a very large Japanese giant salamander right here that came from the Asa Zoo. And here is some of their setups that they had behind the scenes. So a lot more extensive. The Asasu's big claim to fame is the Japanese giant salamanders, but they don't really have a big breeding program for other species. And that's what the Ueno Zoo was doing. And yeah, it blew my mind the number of species that they had. So they had a lot of these, like the pyrogaster, the firebelly newts, Sunhouse pyrogaster. I'm trying to remember what their common name is. Um, But yeah, just those red-bellied newts that were very common in pet stores back in the day. Over here, you have the clawed salamander. So this is, again, you could barely see these. I wouldn't call them actual claws, but they are like kind of more modified, quantified projections that they have. So they're called the clawed salamander. And these are another high-nobid species. It might be like the black salamander or something like that. Um, but just cool species that I had, never even heard of. I get to see in person. And then what for me was boring, for them was pretty cool. These are all salamanders that are either common in the U.S. pet trade or um, if you were to go like herping in like southeastern Virginia. So the axolotl, this is Pleurodel waltii, which is like the ribbed newt, I think is the common name. You have, I believe this one is either a siren or amphiuma right here, and then a red salamander. So for them, these were a big deal because they're exotic, right? But for us, they're native. So you're like, oh yeah, I see these all the time. So just kind of perspectives are a little bit different. And they had a lot of captive breeding programs. So the one cool thing that I noticed here, um, it's before bee sal, so it's like salamander chytrid fungus really kind of caught on with a lot of other zoos about like quarantine procedures. These animals were kept separate from the Asian species. So the Asian species can carry beast style and then not have it affect them. All these kind of New World and European species are affected and will die. So they actually keep them in separate rooms and quarantine each room. You have to go into foot baths in between. So that's one of the first times I've ever seen a zoo do anything like that. And this was like back in 2019. So this is pretty cool. And these are all native species that they are working with. So this is the Okinawan grass lizard, which is very, very rare in Japan, only found in Okinawa, but apparently is a more prolific breeder in captivity than the more wide-ranging Japanese grass lizard. So that was kind of cool to see. And here are some of the eggs right there that they were incubating. And then you have the local Japanese tree frog over here. You can see, I mean, these males were calling. They were very active. So they were in a breeding program for that. And then they also have these guys here, which actually came from the Bronx Zoo, which is kind of cool that they didn't take these out of the wild. So these are crocodile newts, Echinotriton andersoni. So the Bronx Zoo has them in a few zoos in the U.S. It's a very neat. The big adult salamanders were actually hiding, so we only got to see the babies. Um, but let me actually just pull up a picture of these guys because I'm almost done with the presentation. But just in case people don't know what Echinotriton andersoni look like, Echinotriton andersoni. These guys are just a really neat species of newt. So kind of related to the crocodile and the warty newts that you'll get in other areas and kind of more mainland Asia. But pretty neat species, neat newt species with kind of like the flared ribs, but that's just what they look like. This one does look a little emaciated, but they do have these kind of armored plates right here. So just a very funky looking species. Pretty cryptic and pretty shy, so they don't make the best exhibit animals. Um, be a pretty rare animal, only found in Okinawa. So seeing babies of those guys that they're having success with is pretty cool. So I believe they got the adults from the Bronx Zoo, but these are babies that they had just that had just metamorphed out. And then some of their exhibits that were front of house. So you have the Japanese black salamander here, the clawed salamander here. I believe this might be a clouded salamander. Um, but again, having a zoo focus on native species, I wouldn't say unheard of, but pretty cool. And that is kind of one of the reasons why I was drawn to the Calvert Marine Museum is just focusing on native species. People just really need to see what cool stuff is in their own backyards, or else they really won't be appreciative of what's around them. So some of the takeaways here were just again the signage, the programming separating amphibians based on geographical location, which is super important nowadays. Breeding, even though there's no official managed programs, um, and the different Japanese prefectures and stuff like that. Um, yeah, I was kind of blown away with just all the conservation work that these guys were doing at the Ueno Zoo. So goals met, obviously, right? Food and drinks. I love Asian food, so I was in heaven. I did actually get sick of ramen and udon because I just had so much of it, but the sushi was on point. I loved all of it. It was great. But obviously, I didn't go there for the culinary aspects. So being able to see kind of the diet, some live fish that they were using at the Asa Zoo were loaches, which is a very small fish. It's about like two finger lengths and about as thick as my fingers. Um, and these massive salamanders were eating these tiny little fish. So it's just kind of ideas and maybe some like live feeding to try and do for those guys as well. The breeding setups, um, some of the factors that we couldn't do were like the weather factors in an open exhibit. But then also being able to look at the habitat, look at the water flow and depth of how deep some of these environments actually were things that we could try and do at the National Zoo. Maybe do some environmental measurements and talk with other zoos that have been able to breed hellbenders and seeing kind of what they've added into the water. The education at the Ueno Zoo and the Hanzaki Center were awesome, and that was a big portion of what we were trying to do with a lot of our Appalachian species that we had um, at the National Zoo. So, very long-winded, but thank you for sticking around. And I know it was a lot of information, so if you guys have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. I think we have some in the chat.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was amazing.
Yeah, I mean it was awesome because I mean talking about it, I mean I thank you guys because I did this presentation. I haven't done it in like 7 years, I think I was telling Rebecca. So, um, yeah, it was nice to kind of when I was going through and changing up some of the slides and adding a few more pictures to kind of really relive it and be like, wow, I've done some neat stuff.
So Cody was with us earlier, but he had to leave to go to work.
No
Cody is
worries.
apparently work stationed in Okinawa right now, and
Oh,
he's been
get out.
seeing a few of the herps that you were talking about tonight, including the crocodile newt and cave geckos. He wanted to let
That's
everybody know there's
insane.
a guy at Mount Daisian, that does tours to see the giant salamanders in the wild.
That's
And that
awesome.
they're doing work to improve the waterways for the salamanders, and he included a website about it. So I will make sure
Sweet.
to
Well,
send
I will
everyone
do
the
that so I'm not
link.
wasting any time when I go there.
Um,
Yeah,
but
because
that
for
sounds pretty
me,
remarkable. So I know he had to leave, but I wanted to make sure to thank him
oh,
for
that's
all that
awesome.
information.
I gotta ask him how long he's stationed there. Maybe, I mean, he'll show me all the good spots then. I'll
He said that they
just
saw
take a quick
30,
trip out there.
he said they saw 30 salamanders,
That's insane.
a 3 foot large male near his den and 3.5 foot females. So
That's
sounds like a
insane.
pretty amazing trip.
Yeah. And that's the thing too. I mean, because it was for work. So, I mean, I didn't want to be like, oh, I'm going to extend it a week and stay longer just because, I mean, I was already gone for 2.5 weeks. And I mean, I obviously crammed a lot of places in that short amount of time. But I really would have loved, I mean, I did do some exploring and did some touristy stuff, but I would have loved to kind of go out and do like more field work. I just don't think it was the greatest time of year, just because it was very hot, in those areas in Japan. And Japan's such a humongous country. It doesn't look like it on the map, but it's just if you look at it on the globe, it actually covers a lot of land. I mean, some of it's adjacent to Russia, and then others go like Okinawa go very close to the equator. So it's
Mhm.
a very long country with really cool stuff there.
So the breeding programs at the zoos you visited, were they breeding for animals that would be kept in zoos, or were they breeding for animals that would be released to repopulate in the wild?
So my guess is just breeding to kind of keep animals within zoos. Um, just because it's a pretty long trek to get from like, the US over to Japan, and they have a much more extensive breeding program in Japan, even though they are genetically valuable animals. I think it's mainly just to kind of keep the species going in captivity in the United States. Just so you have like genetically fit animals and things like that in the
Mhm.
US for different breeding programs in the US.
Cool.
So a lot of zoos and aquariums work with, I don't think the Japanese giant salamander is a managed program. A lot of amphibians really aren't. Usually they're more like mammal centric for those. But they will have stud books and things like that, or unofficial stud books. Well, they'll work and kind of network with other zoos, see what other zoos and aquariums have, and then kind of make breeding recommendations on animals that most likely aren't related and stuff like that, just to keep genetic diversity up. It's kind of like an arc thinking about it, because then maybe one day you could release them in the wild if you really needed to.
Thank you. Um, so is there these sort of the hybrid animals that the giant salamanders that are breeding between the Chinese
Yeah.
ones and the Japanese and the native Japanese ones? So is there like are there programs to try to go out and catch those animals and remove them from the wild as much as
Yeah.
possible or
Yeah. And it does get tricky because I mean it's a similar problem with like Cuban crocodiles and American crocodiles in Cuba. It's just animals now, don't really would never really mix, even if they live in nearby areas. But just with humans and things like that, you have things that would kind of not be in areas that they should be. And yeah, so as far as I know, that's why they were doing genetic testing to also kind of see where the spread or how quick they are spreading, but they were taking them out of the wild as far as I know. And I'm open if anyone has, yes, the hybrids do produce viable eggs, which is not always the case with a lot of hybrid animals, but those definitely do. They are pretty closely related when you think about it. So they are in the same genus. So they're in the Andrias genus, whereas the hellbenders are Cryptobranchus. But even then, usually animals that are in the same family still sometimes can hybridize.
you may not know this, but how long ago did the hellbender sort of separate from the giant salamanders? Like how did that
Oh
ever sort
gosh. I
of
mean,
happen?
I would just imagine. So, I mean, especially when you think about how everything was together with Pangea. So I don't know with hellbenders per se, but say with just like salamanders in general, you will get some cool like Italian cave salamanders that are in the Hydromantes genus that are also in California. So when you think about it, Appalachia is the oldest mountain chain. So one of the first mountain chains on Earth when we were still all one continent. And so that's one thing I've always wondered. But I was at a salamander conference, right? I'm kind of out nerding myself right now. But it was basically this one professor explained it was everything radiated from Appalachia. So that's why salamanders are so prevalent in Appalachia, but everything kind of radiated from there and into other places. So when other continents and countries broke off, you kind of have some similar related species in other areas of the world that seem very far away, but long ago, they really weren't that far.
So the hellbenders are older genetically,
I've
potentially.
heard both things. I've heard
Okay.
they're a more ancient lineage, and I mean that's why they have lungs, but don't use the lungs.
Hmm.
But then I've heard some other talks where people say that they're more newly evolved than other salamanders. So I don't know. I mean they seem ancient to me, right?
Yeah, they
Just
look
in my
it.
mind, like the larger something is, especially when it's trying to breathe through its skin. I
Hmm.
mean that just seems like near impossible, right? So to me, they seem kind
Yeah.
of like an ancient lineage.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Does anybody else have any questions?
And you guys always feel free to email me too if you think of something that you couldn't think of right now. It's just matthew.neff@calvertcountymd.gov, a very long email, but it is at the beginning when I start the slides if you guys want to kind of go back and take a look. Whether you have any questions about hellbenders or Japanese giant salamanders, anything kind of Herpetological Society field trekking stuff, or even if you want to become involved in FrogWatch, I wear a lot of hats and I'm happy to answer a lot of questions. So
And feel free to reach out to me if you need Matt's contact info. I can always send it your way as well.
awesome. Thank you, everyone.